Hello, America. Welcome to your Leo Nation, where we believe in and support the rule of law. I am the chief, the former chief, the happily retired chief, California Highway Patrol. And with us today are two really great friends. I guess I was like, what do you call it? Man crush or whatever it is. The other day, I was telling John, man, thanks for coming on, man. I'm all giddy about having you on again. So it's all platonic, John. So don't worry about that. All right. It's just, I have such respect for you. But we do have today with us two great friends. And one there, you may recognize that mug as kind of almost a regular good friend of mine. And that is Bill Bodner in retired DEA Special Agent in Charge, LA Field Office. And my mug is a permanent fixture on his show, Truth Nation. You've got to check out if you really want to get some analytical feedback on any number of topics. He's the man for that. And of course, John McKinney, Deputy DA, Los Angeles County, been on the show a number of times over the years. But, you know, it was a few weeks ago, John, I saw you posted something on social media about an undertaking with the DA's office there in LA County. And, you know, right away I start looking up, exactly what's he talking about? I'm going, wow, this is huge stuff. And then immediately I thought about Bill because of the topic. And I'm going to let you explain, but it's called Operation Sugar Diamond. And again, this is so important. And with that, why don't you explain what Operation Sugar Diamond is and the role of the DA's office?
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me on, Mark. Always a pleasure to be on your show, especially since I know that your audience, at least in large part, is made up of current and former law enforcement individuals. And so I love coming on and talking about our trade. And Bill, it's great being on the show with you as well. Operation Sugar Diamond represents the largest takedown of a cannabis extraction lab operation in the history of Los Angeles County, which is saying a lot since we are the largest county in the United States, over 10 million people. This operation came to our attention after two explosions of extraction labs, one in 2023, one in 2024, that in the aggregate killed 5 individuals. Surprisingly, this case came to our attention as a simple extraction lab prosecution case. It wasn't connected to a homicide investigation. It was because of the eagle eye of some of our prosecutors and putting things together that we realized, oh, wait a minute, this isn't just another extraction lab case. This is a homicide case. And it has a lot of tentacles that go into things like, the distribution of butane gas for illicit purposes, the renting and leasing of warehouse space and private properties for criminal activity, the development of retail products, illegal retail products that are being sold and used in large part by young people, some underage. So there's a lot going on here. When we realized what we had, our major narcotics division took over as the primary prosecutorial division to lead this investigation. And it was through that division that our head deputy and assistant head deputy of that division, working together with law enforcement task forces from LA Impact to HIDA to local agencies, planned a 9-location search warrant takedown and arrest operation, which took place a couple weeks ago, that resulted in, get this, Mark, over $100 million of seized illegal cannabis products. Over $100 million in product.
And by the way, this is, if I'm not mistaken, this is one location, John? The $100 million, or was that spread out?
This particular operation is associated with a couple of different known labs. Mm-hmm. One very large one, but there were a couple others throughout the county of Los Angeles.
Yeah, still $100 million.
Producing, product, shipping product across state lines. There's a whole federal component to this investigation where the feds are mostly focused on on the illicit proceeds and asset forfeiture, money laundering type issues. We're prosecuting the homicides and the possession of the illegal cannabis product side. So we're very, very excited about this because it marks a big return of our major narcotics division to criminal prosecution. Some people might be familiar that in the last 4 years, we had a district attorney who was experimenting with certain notions of criminal justice that really suppressed a lot of our prosecutorial divisions, including the major narcotics division. I want to say that the men and women who work in those divisions were always ready and willing to do the work, but they were hamstrung by that prior administration. We have a new district attorney, new leadership. We're taking a new direction and a much more aggressive approach to enforcing the law in this area.
Well, that is certainly true, Bill. I'm going to get to you here in a second. A couple of things that John brought up. And I saw you nod your head as I was, because it's really interesting. But to digress a little bit, you talking about your new boss there, the new DA, Nathan Hochman. I'm just watching some of the things that he's doing. I think it's important to talk about. In other words, like the street racing. I just saw that that he's cracking down on this, doing a great job partnering with law enforcement. The Highway Patrol is so involved with the illegal street racing on county roads or freeways, things like this, and people don't understand how dangerous it is. In other words, you guys have prosecuted people who have been killed at these events. The reason I bring this up is because it's important to understand that Operation Sugar Diamond is not an island unto itself. It's part of a broader philosophy of the new leadership in the DA's office. It's so important. It's comprehensive what you guys are doing now. I'm so happy that it's working the way it should and the way it is under your leadership and that of Nathan Hochman. Bill, going to a couple of things that John touched on, and John, you're talking about extraction. And I know John can talk about this in detail as well, but from your experience, can you explain to the audience, really kind of fill me in about what extraction means and really how that affects kind of the market of cannabis supply?
Yeah, so the market for goods that are made, well, let's look at it this way. I think there's a different marijuana consumer out there today. They're looking for edibles. They're looking for creams. They're looking for beverages with THC in them. All these things require extraction to create. And man, John and Mark too, I'm sure you both remember the explosion in downtown LA on San Pedro Street. I think it was around May of 2020. Yeah. There was, in that kind of wholesale section of LA, there was a building that blew up where they were housing butane and selling butane to people that were doing extraction.
Massive
Here's what it is.
explosion.
You're taking,
just
go ahead, Mark.
blowing that whole storefront just out onto the street. And I'm surprised that, it wasn't worse than it was as far as.
And I think I don't know, a dozen firefighters were hurt. And man, I can't recall if how bad the injuries were. So forgive me if we even lost firefighters in that. I don't remember, but incredible explosion. So what is the use of butane? So you're taking plant material, marijuana plant material, and you're putting it in a vessel. A lot of times they'll use like a lower grade operation will use a PVC type pipe. Higher scale, more industrial operations, stainless steel equipment, they're going to have a stainless steel tube. They're going to stuff that with plant material, and then they're going to introduce butane into that tube. The butane's going to soak through the plant material, and it's going to extract all the terpenes, all the cannabinoids, all the quote good stuff out of the marijuana plant. It's going to extract that and drain out the bottom. In some cases, it's going to drain out the bottom into, like, let's say a bowl in a relatively simple operation. And this is where the danger starts, right? You're going to run butane through it maybe 4 times, 4 different passes. You're going to extract all the desired chemicals out of this cannabis material. And then you have to somehow get the butane out of that mixture, so you're only left with the desired chemicals, the desired stuff. And in a crude operation, that's done through evaporation a lot of times. They'll just let that bowl sit, or that open vessel sit, and that butane will evaporate off. And of course, it's heavier than air. It goes down to the floor. It spreads around. It's not seen. Most of the times butane odorless, and all it has to catch is a spark from a refrigerator starting up, a pilot light on some kind of appliance, and there's an explosion. In a more complex situation or industrial type extraction, which it sounds to me like what this was. And listen, I was still working at DEA in 2023. I remember nothing about this case. So I'm not speaking of this case specifically. I don't know the facts of this case. But generally, in a large industrial operation, they'll try to recapture that evaporated solvent, right? So they'll run their butane through the plant material. It'll be in a closed system where they're trying to recapture the solvent. And then if they're trying to make sugar diamonds, right, which is a super, super refined and potent form of THC or THCA, they're then going to introduce, they're going to get that oil, get as much butane out of it as possible, again, in this closed loop system, and then inject usually propane into it to cool it real fast and try to crystallize it. Without getting into all the science, here's the point. The point is that it requires pressure, and these things, these solvents have a very low boiling point. Mm-hmm. You're talking negative, below zero. So it's not hard to see how there could be a leak, how it could just be mismanaged and there's too much pressure and all of a sudden there's an explosion, a valve doesn't work, etc. So there have been many BHO explosions in the LA area. And this one, unfortunately, unique because of the deaths. But again, it's just extraction to get a very concentrated THC product to use in all these edibles and other things that we see flooding the market now.
That was about 5 minutes of pure education for me, Bill. It really was. The funny thing is, just in the course of being a patrol over the years, and, you come across, just as a regular patrolman, a layperson in regards to production of controlled substances, you come across a lot of stuff, cocaine, heroin, raw opiate coming in from Afghanistan, all those things I've recovered, I've seized, and it's been part of larger operations of which I don't know any of the intricacies. But that's an education for me, and I'm sure for most of the audience. And I want to get back to you on some of the operations from your point of view, Bill. John, going back to you hit on a couple of things. You talked about LA Impact, and you talked about, of course, we talked about the narcotics division of the DA's office, and it's been revitalized, thank God, under Nathan Hochman. But having Bill here right now, you mentioned something about the transportation of these products across state lines. It's a big deal. How, if at all, in this case, or maybe in a more general sense, are you partnering with federal authorities? Can you also explain? I do know what LA Impact is. I had a lot of CHP officers in it over the years, but can you talk about LA Impact? And it's really important to understand this is, especially with you guys revitalizing the narcotics division of your agency. Can you talk about the partnership with LA Impact, what that is, and the federal government, when it's necessary and when it is appropriate, and when it really assists you in your operations?
Yeah, I do want to start with the fact that Nathan Hochman has spent a considerable amount of time rebuilding the LA County DA's offices, relationships with law enforcement, both local, state, and federal. Relationships that suffered in the last administration. There was a lack of trust. There was a lack of alignment on the vision of law enforcement. And we've spent the first 8 months now of the Hochman administration regaining that trust and rebuilding those relationships. And I think as of today, it's fair to say that we have very strong relationships locally, statewide, and with the federal government. The key to good relationships, obviously, is communication and respect for each other's roles. And both in the area of narcotics and violent crime across the board, which we prosecute out of my bureau, I can say I've been in a lot of meetings with U.S. attorneys and FBI agents and DEA agents, and we're just all collaboratively trying to find the best way forward. In the spirit of that cooperation, we have a number of task forces that are out there on the streets every day, made up of local law enforcement officers, state officers, federal, all working together in that same collaborative spirit. LA Impact being one that focuses on high volume narcotics distribution and sales and manufacturing and whatnot. We're working very closely with them. We have a couple of other county agencies and task forces that are all joining in that effort as well. Now, this Operation Sugar Diamond, by the way, when this first came to my attention, again, as an extraction lab case with some homicides, I told the leadership of our major narcotics division, they told me initially, hey, John, this is a big deal. Like, we really need to put some resources behind this. And I said, this is so big, it needs a name. This thing needs a name behind it. And they came up with the name Operation Sugar Diamond. And when I first heard the name they had given to it, I didn't know what sugar diamonds were. Probably most of your audience didn't know. Frankly, it sounded to me like a stripper.
Yeah,
sure.
But
It was a colorful
John,
name,
we're all thinking the same thing here. I was going to say it if you didn't, so thank you.
And, they explained to me what a sugar diamond was. At the end of the day, Bill talked about one of the finished products of this elaborate extraction and refinement process is you get these very crystal-like, almost like, looks like rock candy. Maybe for some of the older members of the audience who remember what rock candy looks like. Shards of almost glass-looking material that's almost pure THC. You can get up to 99% pure THC, which is then sold as is and could be further refined and used in different products, from vaping to edibles, as Bill said. So that's where the name Sugar Diamond comes from. It comes from that highly profitable finished product of almost pure THC. So, from a law enforcement point of view, our job is to work collaboratively across the board with the boots on the ground and bring cases when we can. And whether it's through the major narcotics division or a lower level division that prosecutes smaller amounts of cocaine, meth, fentanyl, or whatever the drug might be. That's what we're doing now, which is a big difference from what we were doing for the last 4 years.
Well, I should say that it is, and I think you kind of lay this out, when you first introduce yourself or start talking about the operation a little bit ago. But I think people, we look at drug trafficking, possession, distribution, production. We sometimes look at it as a crime unto itself, isolate it, but that is, literally never the case. When you talk about trafficking and production, there's always something. You laid it out very well about all these multiple violations of law that occur with the production and the distribution. The list is sometimes almost endless, and it ties in. You could talk about home invasions, you talk about vehicle theft, of course, kidnapping, things like this when we get into kind of the higher operations of drug trafficking. But one of the things, and Bill, I'm going to go to you on this, because you and I have talked about this either on this show or Truth Nation, your show. But, I was around there in California when all this legalization with marijuana, cannabis started to happen, and the medical use, and maybe I was just Pollyannic. I think I was right, but I was opposed to it from day one. I'm a libertarian in so many things, but I just didn't see this going well. But one of the arguments about legalizing cannabis, one of the big arguments was we're going to take the criminal element out of it. We're going to control it. We're going to tax it. It's all going to be above board, blah, 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 blah. And then we find out that 80% of, I think, based on an article I read, about 80% of all of cannabis sales in LA County are illegal. 80%. Now, before the law legalized cannabis, it was only 100% that was illegal. It's still 80%. So can you give us your take on this from a former DEA, top manager? about, how we got here. I think John laid out some things about, the process, the extraction. You did too. Why are we at a point where it seems to be as bad or worse now than it was before we legalized it?
And that's why this case is so important, Mark. If you're someone that believes in legal marijuana, you need to support John McKinney. You need to support Nathan Hochman in doing enforcement actions like this. Here's why. The vote happened in 2016 in California, if I'm not mistaken. The law went into effect in 2018. In 2019, the very next year, the California's own marijuana regulatory body, the state agency responsible for regulating cannabis, they said 80% of the market was black market in 2019. I can tell you for sure it was worse in 2020, 2021, and 2022, but they stopped estimating the market. They stopped estimating the black market because quite frankly, it looked so bad. Probably it was 90% plus. I think what we're seeing now is a little bit of a change. And now it's a lot of gray market stuff where probably operations like this are so important. In other words, there's a legal licensed maker of some type of edible product, but they're purchasing some of their, let's say, sugar diamonds on the black market because it's just so much cheaper. So what does that do? The legal creator, the legal producer can't compete, Mark. They just simply can't compete with the tax structure, with the regulatory environment. It's impossible for a legitimate producer to compete. So they go out of business, and the black market, so to speak, only grows stronger. So cases like this are so important because without someone doing regulation and compliance, this experiment, which is not an experiment anymore, this legal cannabis will never work out the way it was intended. So kudos to the DA's office for getting involved in this and trying to go after the people that aren't complying with the laws, because that's the only thing at this point that's going to make it work.
No, it's a good assessment. And John, going back to the feds on this, because obviously, and we're not going to get into it, there's no point to on this show, but obviously there is some friction between officials in California and the federal government right now as far as law enforcement, things like that. But it doesn't mean it has to be that way with every single operation. We would hope that there are some things that, kind of both sides of the aisle see as so important that we need to use all legitimate resources as best we can to resolve the issue. One of the things that we know that as far as the federal government is concerned, that marijuana sales are still illegal. I mean, this is the funny thing that we deal with here, and obviously makes things very difficult. By the way, full disclosure, not disclosure, but I want people to know, I realize here in Florida, I call it the free state of Florida, they legalized marijuana sales here too. And these shops are all over the place. Did I go to hell and go back to California? What's that going on here? So even here in even here in Florida, we have this, but does it complicate things for you, or do you work with, say, with, Bill Saley or another, U.S. attorney on federal charges as far as, producing this kind of stuff with extraction and, the manufacture, distribution on a federal level? Or are you only concerned about, in other words, the local and state laws?
Well, I think part of the communication we have with the federal government is collaborating and agreeing on who will handle which prosecutions. There are just certain prosecutions that are better handled under federal law by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And then there are other things that are more traditional state crimes or just better handled by local prosecutors and federal prosecutors. And I think 90% of the time, it's pretty clear to us who should take what lane. There may be some cases where it's a close call as to who has the best path forward and who should prosecute certain cases. Resources come into play as well. But from my viewpoint, up to this point, we've had a very good relationship with making those decisions. Now, obviously, there's the politics of public safety, and then there is the actual craft, the work of public safety. We're focused on the work. We're not focused on the politics. Politics never come up in any of the meetings that I've attended, whether it's with local, state, or federal, or all three at the table. There's some disagreements about certain politics around public safety, and I leave it to those people to have those debates. But I think we're all pretty much in agreement that we don't want dangerous drugs on the streets. Some people don't want any drugs on the streets. We get into that debate over whether this should have ever been a path we went down at all. I think I agree with you that I was very skeptical of legalized cannabis and didn't think it was a good idea, and would have wished we would have held the line rather than give into it. It's not turning out the way it was sold to the public in terms of, we're going to have enormous tax dollars and we'll be able to use that money for treatment and all that. I don't think that's panning out quite that way. But from the application of our laws, the enforcement, regulating these products, these labs, so that when they operate under the law, they're done in a way that's safe, that don't risk lives. That's what we are focused on here in the DA's office.
I was reading an article here not too long before we went to record, and this is public, and I'm pretty comfortable you can talk about this because it's out there in the article. And if you can't, we get it. I want the audience to understand that this case is in the criminal process, and we obviously don't want you to do anything to jeopardize that. But it does talk about these, I believe it's 4 or 5 individuals being charged with murder. Is that correct?
In this particular case, we've charged 2 individuals with murder. One with 5 murders, and up to this point, one with only one of those 5.
That's where I got the 5. We'll see 5 victims.
That may change as evidence continues to come to light, but we'll see.
So the reason I bring that up is because, and this is kind of getting deep in the weeds. Sorry, about the elements of the crime, because when we talk about murder, obviously you have to have intent, unlike manslaughter. So when I look at this from, former cop's point of view, things like that, how do you guys develop? And again, if we're getting too close to the actual case, and just tell me, can't talk about it. But how do we get to a point of charging murder? By the way, I'm glad you are. I'm clicking my heels for these dirtbags, about these dirtbags. But how do we get to that point with the elements, John, with murder? Because it seems like, in other words, is the intent factor there? And tell me if I'm wrong as a layperson here about the elements, but because off the top of my head, I'm thinking, okay, this could be obviously a felony manslaughter, easy. How do we get to murder in this case?
And that's a great question. And again, I can answer this question without talking about the particulars of the case surrounding Operation Sugar Diamond. There are basically 2 theories of murder that apply to a situation where an illegal cannabis extraction lab explodes and takes lives. One is an implied malice murder theory, where you are alleging that the person was aware of an extreme danger to human life and disregarded it. And that disregarding those dangers led to the death of someone. And Bill explained that this butane gas is highly combustible. Anybody who handles it, who has any knowledge of it, especially who handles it in large volume, knows that even static electricity can set off an explosion if that gas is present. So in the case of a person who is running a lab and is familiar with how the lab works and what this gas is by definition taking an extreme risk to human life and running that lab and putting profit over people's lives. And so if there's an explosion, prosecutors in a case like that could go forward on a theory of implied malice murder. Another theory of liability is the felony murder rule. And the felony murder rule essentially says that if a person is engaged in a dangerous felony and one enumerated in a statute like arson, and a death occurs, if the prosecution can show that that person was a major participant in the crime, then that person could be held accountable for any deaths that occur. Now, in a case where a lab explodes, it's not your typical arson. It's not as if someone set about intentionally setting a fire. But again, our courts have looked at a number of cases involving these extraction labs and in some cases meth labs that have exploded and said, well, wait a minute, the danger here is too obvious to ignore. So even though the person may not intentionally set the fire, they're operating under conditions that are so likely to lead to a fire and an explosion that they're basically one and the same. So those are a couple of different theories to get to murder in a case where an extraction lab explodes and kills people.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you want a clear explanation of why this reaches the level of murder, you talk to Deputy DA John McKinney and not former CHP Chief Mark Garrett. And I'm not kidding here. This has been a great education for me, and I've dealt with that, really with traffic laws, or you're talking about secondary murder with the fourth DUI and things like this. And so we don't always have to have that clearly articulable intent, but that was me jumping to conclusions about where is the intent here. And man, you really laid it out so well, Bill. And this is for kind of either of you, but I do want to go to you, Bill, and John, if you want to chime in and maybe have the last word here on today's episode, because this is kind of where I want to finish. Again, it's fantastic that the new boss in LA County and his team, people like you, are taking on this issue. But I do wonder, and again, Bill, I'll start with you. Is there, and if there is, how big? In other words, is this just local, or are these operations part of a much larger conspiracy? Are these operations often, are they obviously federal? Are they across state lines? Are they international? Are they in South America, Central America? Or these kind of, for lack of a better phrase, kind of one-off operations that kind of grow, kind of big in Los Angeles County or whatever county, or are they part of a bigger network?
Interesting question. So I know this is a problem even on the East Coast now, like in Maine specifically, they have a huge problem with illegal cannabis growing and extraction, et cetera. What I saw my last few years at DEA, and again, this is speaking in generalities, a large influence of Chinese organized crime in these illegal grows and illegal extraction operations. And is there a connection between that and some more nefarious thing? I think so. There's been some evidence of that. It gets complicated. There's this idea of capital flight out of China. How do you get money out of China when there's such tight capital flight restrictions? They don't just allow you to, if you're a wealthy person in China, you're not just allowed to transfer your wealth out of the country. There's laws against it. So by generating cash in illegal business, by generating untraceable, quote, off the books cash in an illegal business in the United States, you can create that cash and kind of do swaps to allow people to get their wealth out of China. What is that wealth being used for here in the States? There's been, interesting cases about Chinese national crime here in the United States where they're operating their own pseudo police forces. I don't know if you've heard about that, Mark, where they're kind of, and going after people that have debts in China and going after people who have left China, et cetera, et cetera.
Operating out of their embassies and other storefronts. Yes.
Correct. So, the question is, where does all that money to finance those operations come from? And I think the federal government, at least, is starting to look at some of these Chinese organized crime illicit enterprises as being the source for generating some of those funds. So it's definitely something to keep your eye on. And, up until this point, quite frankly, Mark, what was the stick? In other words, why not? Why not? The worst that was going to happen to you is you were going to get a ticket, basically a misdemeanor offense. You weren't going to do any jail time. So why not use the cannabis industry to acquire this cash to do other nefarious things. There's no reason not to. And I think, again, this is an important case to me because it'll cause people to think twice about that, I think. And even the people who are believers in legalized cannabis, you need compliance and regulation. Otherwise, it's never going to work.
It's an excellent point about why not. Previously, there's a new sheriff in town, so to speak, and those days are gone. By the way, I do want to clarify something that I mumbled a few minutes ago when I said someone's fourth DUI. I need to finish that. Fourth DUI now results in them killing someone in a crash. In other words, this is obviously they have the knowledge of their behavior could take someone's life clearly, and we can charge, usually second-degree murder on that. As a comparison to what you laid out there, John.
Right.
John, anything to add? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Excellent analogy, by the way, because everyone understands the DUI context of a person who has prior DUIs. They've been warned about the dangers of it. They repeat the dangerous conduct and then kill somebody. Yeah, at some point, it's not just a DUI anymore. You took a life and you knew the risks involved. The same logic applies to these cannabis labs.
Hey, can I ask a quick question, John? A little bit off topic, but maybe not so much. I think we're talking about maybe like a Watson advisement, right?
Right, exactly.
So, will the DA's office do? And I know you're not Nathan Hochman, but do you see the DA's office potentially in the future looking at drug-caused deaths and looking at homicide charges as, let's say, Hestron is done in Riverside or some of the other counties? I don't think it's been done in LA County. I could be wrong, but is there any
Bill,
thought on that?
I'm so glad you asked that question because in keeping with the theme that our major narcotics division is back in a robust way, we are now prosecuting fentanyl-related deaths, something that wasn't happening before. We specially trained some prosecutors who are now in the major narcotics division to screen those cases and bring prosecutions in partnership with the federal government, because they have a very nice statute actually available for those kinds of deaths that don't require proof of intent. We still have to prove intent. But in keeping with the idea of a multiple DUI offender who then kills, somebody who's aware of the dangers of fentanyl and knows that fentanyl is in just about every hard drug nowadays and still sells it or furnishes it, they're running the risk of being prosecuted for murder. And we are looking for those cases. We've let law enforcement know we're open for business. You don't have to take those cases to the U.S. Attorney's Office anymore. Bring them to us and we will prosecute them. Also, as part of Prop 36, there is now a fentanyl admonition. For anyone who's convicted of possession or sale of fentanyl, the court is required to read to them what in the DUI context is a Watson warning. Now they get a fentanyl warning, so that if in the future they furnish drugs and someone dies, they can't say they didn't know the dangers of fentanyl and that it could cause death. So I'm very happy you asked that question, because when I came on, that is something that I wanted an opportunity to say, that we are aggressively prosecuting drug-related cases, especially those that lead to a death.
And again, Mark, I got to chime in here because I love to hear that. For the people out there that feel like drug trafficking is a victimless crime and we shouldn't be incarcerating drug traffickers, I always bring up the same case. It's a real case that happened in Pasadena in 2020, where in one weekend, one drug dealer caused 7 overdoses, 7 poisonings, and 3 of those people died. And my question is, what is a more imminent threat to the public at that point in time than that drug dealer? Because we all know what's going to happen the next weekend if that person's not taken off the streets. So it's great to hear that the DA's office is doing that and recognizing that there's harm coming from certain drug dealers out there, and there's a real public safety issue.
Absolutely.
Well, it is. It's a ground level. It's a ground level issue that affects everybody, whether you feel it immediately or not. And Bill, I'm so glad that you posed that question. And John, I think you were going to touch on it anyway, but I'm really glad you brought that up, Bill. Look, this is what we need. Look, the tagline for the show is, we believe in and support the rule of law. This is exactly what we're talking about, the rule of law. And it seems like, John, what you and, Mr. Hochman and the rest of the team are doing, it seems so obvious. It seems so simple, not easy. I mean, it's a big process, but logically it seems so simple. But I want people to realize how far away, because of the previous DA, not just because of him, because he was part of a larger culture that turned their back on law enforcement. And I mean that literally, turn their back on enforcing the law in California. We got so far away from that. Now, this seems just like magic, and in a way it is, but it's simply getting back to what elected officials and prosecutors and law enforcement officers are supposed to do. And
Right.
it's so refreshing. It's so encouraging. Again, we escaped California by a no small part because of the lack of adherence to the rule of law. And I'm cheering, I'm praying for California. I hope it comes back full swing in the most robust way, and people can walk down the street and feel that prosecutors like you, police officers, are backed up to their job and are able to provide the highest level of safety and security for the people of Los Angeles County, and of course the people all throughout California. John McKinney, Deputy DA, Los Angeles County; Bill Bodner, retired DEA Special Agent in charge, LA Field Office. I thank you both. It is so much fun. This truly was an education for me. I think that this would be good for prosecutors across the country to listen to, and for law enforcement officers to listen to, because I know I learned a lot. There's a lot of empty room up here, so I have more capacity. But for anybody, this is a great education. Thank you both. God bless you. We'll see you next time here on your Leo Nation.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, John.